follows. Hi Phil, my question to you is this. Why do we feel the need to categorize terrorists by race, religion, etc.? Why don't we deal with these people the same way we deal with other criminals? Name them, shame them, charge them, etc. The categorization aspect seems highly politicized. I think you can see why this question is linked very much to the first one, and it goes with how we as a society address terrorism. How do we report it? How do we cover it? How do we deal with it? And my answer is going to, not surprisingly, be very similar to the answer to the first question, in that we label or categorize terrorism for what it is for two very important reasons. First and foremost, most countries have put in place laws that treat terrorism differently from other forms of crime. I will cite, for example, the Canadian Criminal Code, because as a Canadian, that's what I know best. But there's a whole section of the Criminal Code that talks about terrorism as a serious act of violence which is carried out or planned for reasons of religious, political, or ideological motivation. In other words, if there's a serious act of violence that's carried out for reasons other than those or for unknown reasons, it's simply not terrorism. Now, we can argue, and maybe I'll get to this in a future podcast, whether or not we should treat terrorist acts more harshly in terms of sentencing legislation than we should other forms of violence, including murder. That's a separate issue. So our criminal codes ask us to categorize things as they are. Secondly, I would argue that as analysts, as those interested in talking about terrorism, it's really important to differentiate terrorism from other forms of violence. If you want to understand what terrorism is all about, with the ultimate goal of putting in place measures to either prevent it from happening or, in a perfect world, preventing those from actually radicalizing to violence in the first place, which in many cases leads to terrorism, you have to know what you're talking about. And if you were to eschew or ignore things like categorization, so what is, you're looking at the motivation. Is it religious? If it's religious, what religion is it? If it's a particular religion, what sect, what aberration, what non-normative or non-mainstream version of the religion is getting at this? What kind of materials are people consuming, etc., etc. We need to do that to gain the fullest possible understanding of a particular act of terrorism. That's what the science of analysis demands. You don't ignore information that's important because you're afraid of making it worse, or you're afraid of embellishing it, or you're afraid of giving terrorists more credibility or more attention than they deserve. You're simply trying to analyze a phenomenon. In this way, I would argue that terrorism analysis is like any other scientific discipline, either social science or pure science. You gather data, you look at the data, you, in some cases, maybe not necessarily in terrorism, I would argue, you would run the data through some kind of a paradigm, or you have an existing hypothesis as to what's happening, and you look to see if your data in fact supports the hypothesis or does not. Bottom line is that you've got to measure, categorize, qualify what you've collected to the best possible ability, and then come up with, in some cases, an overarching theory as to what's driving terrorism or a subset of terrorism, etc. So in this case, I would again disagree with the person who posed the question in saying that both our criminal codes demand that we treat terrorism differently, and that's an open debate. And like I said, we'll have that debate at some point. More importantly is that from an analytical perspective, and I did work as an analyst in the Canadian intelligence community for more than 3 decades, to be true to my profession, it is really important to call things for what they are. Again, I'll bring in Brian Jenkins, that terrorism is theater, terrorists want attention, and as he famously said in another paper he wrote years ago, that terrorists want more people watching rather than more people dead, which is true, because the people who are watching become afraid, and then they do things that terrorists want us to do, cutting back on liberties, adopting legislation, pulling out troops, etc., etc. But again, I think at the end of the day, we need to describe terrorism for what it is, as opposed to calling it something generic, that it in the sense that it shares some commonalities with general criminality and general violence. So from my perspective, going forward, I'm not going to change the way that I do things. I'm going to be as honest as I can, as accurate as I can as an analyst in trying to describe and account for the data that I see. I won't always be right. I certainly have made mistakes in my career as an analyst, and I make mistakes in my post ceases my post-intelligence career, but I'm going to do the best job I possibly can given the knowledge that I have and given the support I have from other analysts out there. So no, going forward, I'm going to categorize terrorism for what it is.